So I finished my van build out just over 5 years ago now, and I never made a video on it, or even a van tour for that matter. This week I thought I would honor my Zen den by showing how Eva became my little nest and what it was like to build her out, as well as some other life details happening in between. So this is a start to finish video. But I do have to point out that I did not have the budget or the time to go full force, so this was not a fast build at all. I used her as my daily driver and could only work on her on my days off work, so there was that factor. And I would save up, research what to buy, do what I could with the resources at the time, and I knew very little going into all of this, the logistics on if it would even work out. I just knew I needed something different, and as I worked on the van, it also gave me the space to work on myself, which was not as easy as it sounds, but I digress. So let's go back in time. I found Eva on Craigslist at the end of 2016, actually, and immediately named her after the little robot character on WALL-E. They had a very similar color scheme. She was the girl searching for signs of organic life on Earth. But anyways, the listing was for a 1991 7.3-liter Econoline diesel that was initially built as an airport shuttle bus. When I got her, she was pretty cherry with an odometer reading of only 7,000 miles. Very low for a 7.3 diesel, but I did have to put work into her maintenance-wise in order to get her back up and running, since she had sat in an airplane hangar for a long time. After making her mechanically sound, I went straight to the demo work. I actually don't have much footage of what the interior looked like prior, except for these few photos. I wasn't planning on filming the build until later on, but it essentially had some bus seats, a handicap lift, and some flooring with a lot of hardware to secure things in place. The first step was turning it into a blank slate and assessing the build from there. It's definitely a mess, but here I had pulled off all of the trim and took out the back seats and lift. I tore out the back AC, and you can see my cleaning supplies stuffed in here also because, well, I had to work simultaneously. I was in the southeast, and the humidity and heat were always a killer when it came to getting any work done, but I was pushing forward and super motivated no matter the weather. Working at night was pretty nice because that was when the heat would break and mostly when I had free time. Here, I'm pulling down the previous walls and just inspecting what was going on behind them. I wanted to get rid of the old insulation and start fresh. I went in with some Goo Gone to remove the old adhesive so that the sound deadening material would be placed on a clean slate. Here, I'm starting to pull up the old flooring. I might have gotten too excited and ordered some of the electrical components way earlier than needed, and this was back when the markets were mainly AGM for your batteries, so they were really heavy. I definitely recommend waiting to get all of your components until you are actually ready for it, and for sure go with lithium instead of AGM. I'm throwing some clips of the general work I had to do alongside the build. I feel like that was a main part of life then, and I couldn't do it without some form of income for the materials. I kept working in housekeeping. Just prior to that, I helped my uncle in a condo renovation, and during, my sister and I also sold artwork and jewelry at local markets. Oh, and I also was babysitting my nephew quite a lot as well. But yeah, so life was still going on in the middle of everything, and it was certainly a challenge since I still needed the van for work transporting goods. But that is okay. It was a lot, and so I feel like it deserves to be acknowledged that when you are in the middle of changing your lifestyle, it's not always easy. Looking back now, I realized the markets were a ton of fun, but so much work that we kind of got burnt out. I will look back on this part of life quite fondly, though.
What's this?
After the art market season died down in the winter, I was able to get back to work on the flooring. I ended up pulling everything out, which included the old plywood and the hardware holding everything in place. I welded any of these holes from the bolts removed, then cleaned up any debris in order to prime paint and prepare to get this tiny home started. It had been over a full year before I got to this stage, and I was starting to get a little antsy, but let's fast forward. I didn't have any video footage of putting the under layers down, but I used a thick rubber sound deadener, a layer of cork, and a layer of reflectix before putting in the framing for the floors. I used denim as the insulation, and it honestly was a ton of fun puzzling all of this together. Now that I think of it, that is kind of what this whole build was. Most of this work was new to me, and getting to explore new tools and techniques in order to tackle the next steps felt extremely empowering, especially when you get to see the results of your labor. And I kind of guess that goes for most things in life, no matter how challenging it can get. Oh, and do not hesitate to ask for help from mentors along the way. I had never framed a floor before, so thankfully my mom's boyfriend was excited and willing to help me with this part. I probably did not need to paint the subfloor, but I found it nice knowing it was going to be sealed, so I did it anyways. Plus, it was very calming. After taking the old fiberglass insulation out, I put some sound deadening material up all around the sheet metal, then needed to re-insulate. I applied the denim insulation with a spray adhesive and also just put some heavy-duty duct tape up to keep it from ever slouching. Don't underestimate the power of duct tape. It can be very effective. I decided to just use the same walls that were initially there because they were in great condition despite being almost 27 years old. It's called FPV board, a flexible sheet sometimes used in sailboats, and I just put some reflectix on the back side of it with the same spray adhesive, and after that, everything was ready to get put back in place. After getting things back together, I then realized I wanted the trim to be white versus black. It would just make the space feel much larger, so I uninstalled them and got to work on refinishing. It was a textured plastic piece, so it took a lot of sanding and multiple coats to get that final look, but I knew it would be worth the extra bit of work. Afterwards, I was definitely happy with the results as it did make the space feel open and pretty inviting as well. It was time to finish the flooring, and I went with another layer of cork as the underlayer here, then this flexible yet durable laminate click flooring that seemed to be yet another puzzle to piece together. Now that the foundation was finally finished, I was ready to move into the creative work of outfitting this empty shell into a livable space. This is the part where you get to sit for hours inside an empty space and envision how it could best be used. My vision was to have it as open and simple, yet as functional as possible. And luckily, I was able to ask my dad for some rendering help, and together we came up with some visual aids in SketchUp. I ended up going in and adjusting the measurements so that they were just right because we were going to give all of these numbers to one of his coworkers who owned a CNC machine. And so then it was my job to secure all the materials and bring the empty van to him so he could run the plywood through the machine, and then we could assemble everything together. The roof of the van is actually a double-layered fiberglass high top, and in between is a series of super thick steel roll bars going down the entire length, so this is what we attached the upper cabinets to. I was beyond grateful and happy to have mentorship from such a master carpenter. When everything was finished, I just couldn't believe my eyes. This was a major step forward, and now it was up to me to finalize everything. Part of me really enjoyed that natural wood look, and I wasn't sure if I should just seal it and call it a day, but I decided to paint everything as professional as I could. That included me removing the doors and hinges and getting a good bit of coats on everything. Of course, sanding in between as well. Now that everything was painted, it was back to reassembling. The butcher block countertop needed to be sealed, but I didn't want to stain it anything too dark, so I ended up using a clear matte finish that brought out the grain of the wood and still protected it. And here were the final results. Now that everything was painted on the interior, it was time to tackle the big one, the exterior. I never painted a vehicle before, but I was excited for the challenge. First, I needed to get the roof completed. I sanded the first layer off, then ended up going with a marine grade paint for fiberglass boats. And this ensured it to withstand any of the elements and still be walkable, so that way I could access the solar panels in the future. For the rest of the body, I was so incredibly blessed that I had an auto body friend allowing me to be a part of the process of getting it done in a professional shop. And I learned a lot, mostly that all of the labor is in the prep work. It was a big job, very time consuming, but fun nonetheless. We repainted the blue with a neutral green color, and the rest was repainted white. And it turned out even better than what I was ever envisioning. So far, everything looked wonderful, and it felt like so much progress was being made. But I never mentioned throughout most of the build, I was simultaneously dealing with a health crisis from previous issues, all beginning to accumulate and really take a toll on me physically. I ended up having to pause everything at one point and devote most of my finances to getting surgery done, which was in 2017, and that added a lot of stress to my plate. Right after painting the van, when I was truly in the thick of it, I received a phone call from my uncle. Even though it felt like a hard choice to do a 180, the universe gifted me an amazing opportunity to pack my bags, leave the East Coast and my van build in order to take care of a furry family member in exchange for room and board in Hawaii for 6 months. Something you just can't refuse. I ran toward that opportunity as fast as I could because in it I knew I would be able to come back to a sense of fundamental well-being. And during that time, I truly did. I began to exercise more, ground with the earth, eat healthier, and I also started my YouTube back then, documenting most of my experience dealing with health and wellness. My nervous system came back to regulation. My uncle's contract ended. He moved back home, and I was ready to get back to the mainland to finish work on my rig. I was so refreshed and ready to jump back in. First on the agenda was to power up this little off-grid home on wheels. I ended up going with 400 watts of solar, and I affixed the panels to the steel roll bars that were in between the fiberglass high top layers. I knew nothing of electricity except for some experiments we did in elementary, powering up a light bulb from a potato. So this was literally me going back into the school of YouTube to understand what I had to do. Most people start with their electrical by running wires behind the walls and having the whole system figured out, but I didn't know what I was doing, and honestly, I was very adamant about not wanting to hide any wires behind walls, just in case for future access. And instead, I just ran them through some tubing hidden underneath the cabinets, and it all worked out. I initially went with 400 amp hours of AGM batteries, and they worked for some time, but later on I switched them out for 200 amp hour lithium, and that was a game changer. Everything was pretty much 12 volt, and then I installed a 2000 watt inverter so I could run my blender. And we have light. After all of that, we finally had some power. Similar to the electrical, I didn't want any pipes behind the walls just because of access reasons, and it's very common in vans for things to freeze over, so it was important for me to not hide anything behind walls where they could just leak. So my water system is extremely simple and probably my proudest feature of the van. 2 6-gallon tanks are under the worktop to the left, a 2-gallon gray water sits under the sink, and a simple foot pump powers it all. For hot water, I just use my kettle, and there you have it. Now it was time to get the bedding and decor in place so I could finally move in. I went with a latex bedding, 2 inches of soft on top, 3 inches of medium on the bottom, and I cut everything with a bread knife since it needed to be custom and removable for storage access. I added some plants and literally all of my belongings, and that was it. A little over 2 years of hard work, all summed up in just a little over 20 minutes. Now it's time to enjoy the fruits of my labor.